Hi, everyone. I think we can get rolling in a couple of minutes. We do have two people here at the Bangor Public Library and about nine on Zoom, so I thought that's great. Um, I'll just give a really brief introduction before we get started with the talk. I've been interested in Dr. Carrier's work for a while. I've read some of his work. I thought it'd be nice to set up something like this, a talk in Maine and also online. Um, I probably like most of you were introduced to the idea, Christ myth theory or as something that's not accepted within the mainstream of academia. So I think that leads a lot of people to reject it outright and not really examine it. I then found Dr. Carrier's work, and I think he presents a very strong case for the claims that he's making, and that led me just to read more and learn more about it. And I'll just hand it off to you. And if you're not speaking, if you could mute yourself, this just helps background noise and things like that. I appreciate it.
All right. Hello. Can everybody see me? I can't tell if my talking head is visible.
I can see you. Yeah. Can
Okay.
you maybe pin him?
Okay. Yeah, so this talk today won't be a talk about why I think a case can be made that Jesus didn't exist. That case, I've done many talks on that. This talk today is actually going to be about the next step in that argument. I'll touch on some aspects of it, but I'm not going to cover every little piece of evidence and question regarding that here. Today, I'm just going to focus on, well, three things. One is the new book that I just submitted to the publisher, and then methodology. I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think math is more important to this debate than anyone wants to admit. And then I'm going to apply that to some aspects of the extra biblical evidence, examples of evidence outside the Bible and how we should deal with that. Okay, so Zoom thinks I'm speaking Arabic. I'm going to tell it I'm speaking English. Okay, I don't know why. Okay, so how to begin? This all started, gosh, it started with a research project to write this book, which is on the historicity of Jesus, which is a thick academic monograph, peer-reviewed monograph, laying out the case and why we should rethink the way we're dealing with evidence and come to a different conclusion about how Christianity began. I did eventually write that into a colloquial version, which is Jesus from Outer Space, which is a thinner, no footnotes, um, much more readable and brief take on summary of that case. But before all of that, I actually published a methodology book, which is Proving History, Bayes' Theorem, and the Quest for the Historical Jesus. And that is another academic monograph. It doesn't address the historicity of Jesus, except to explain that the methods don't work that they're using in the field currently. And then one other book I want to point out is this, which is Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ. This is just a collection of my peer-reviewed articles in history up to 2014, and it includes important articles relating to this issue, and including things I'm going to talk about today. For example, Tacitus and Josephus we'll get to eventually. Now, in 2023, which is just last year, or gosh, is it now? 2023, with Sheffield Phoenix, which is the academic press that published on the historicity of Jesus, it came out with the revised edition. And it's basically done as the same pagination. It's essentially identical, but there's a ton of typos and minor errors that are corrected throughout the book. It is a better version of the text. And because of that, we're not going to do a second edition, at least not anytime soon. What we decided to do, and what my publisher asked me to do, and I agreed ultimately that that was the best move, which is to write a new volume. Now that we're 10 years on, it's going to be the 10-year anniversary this year of the publication of On the Historicity of Jesus. And that book, I have tentatively titled it, well, this is the working title. I don't know if this title will survive. It's up to the publisher and so on. But the current working title is The Obsolete Paradigm of a Historical Jesus. And the book is going to be about how things have changed, where we've moved on since I published 10 years ago. How has the debate evolved? Where is the debate now? Things like that. And so it is an update, sort of a second volume to the first edition, the first volume. The new book is going to be under 400 pages, so it'll be half the size of the original on the historicity of Jesus. And I have no idea how long it's going to take to undergo peer review, corrections, proofing, and so on before publication. That's all out of my hands now, but I've submitted the manuscript, so it's done. Now it just has to go through the motions behind the scenes on that. The submitted draft has 11 chapters, and what I'll do here first is I'm going to explain what each chapter is and why it is in this new book, and then I'm going to focus on 2 chapters, break this down into that. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully my talking head won't be too much in the way. So here's the first slide. Those are the 4 books that I just showed you, or those are 3 of the 4 books that I just showed you, and among other books that I've written. If you want to know more about me and everything, look at the website there, richardcarrier.info, at the bottom of the screen. That has everything, links to all my social media, my background, my curriculum vitae, my blogs, links to get my books, and so on. Okay, so here are the chapters. In the new book. So the first chapter is going to be questioning the historicity of Jesus 10 years on, which is going to be like where we are now. Just a quick brief of what happened in 2014 and what books I published, what books have been published since on this question, and so on. Chapter two will go into updates, developments, and trend line. This chapter goes into a lot of little facts throughout the book, and what other scholars have published on those topics since. So since 2014, it's been 10 years. There's actually been a lot of publications on the extra biblical evidence, on background knowledge, lots of information that relates to the book. And all of it has actually trended in the direction that I was already going. So all the arguments I made in the original book are actually stronger now than they were 10 years ago. And so that chapter will go into that and document it all and cover it. Chapter 3 is the inadequacy of critical responses so far, where I will actually go into and discuss all the formal critical responses, not the online silliness, but the actual academic responses. And I'll analyze them and show why they're actually avoiding the argument rather than addressing it and coming into contact with it. What we should have had, is an actual proper defense of the historicity of Jesus that avoids all the methodological problems that I and many other scholars have pointed out. We're not getting that. No one is doing it, and no one has done it since. And that's a problem, and I show that it's a problem, it's actually happening, and then explain why that's an issue that we need to deal with. Then chapter 4 is an inordinate fondness for suspiciously bad arguments. One thing I document there is that the arguments for the historicity of Jesus have actually gotten worse since I published in 2014. They haven't gotten better. They haven't improved them. They're worse. They're actually getting particularly terrible. And so I document many examples of that and show why they're bad. They're bad arguments. And I'm going to skip 5 and 6, chapters 5 and 6, because that's what the rest of this talk is going to be about. Chapter 7, I have this chapter, The Mistaken Invention of Docetism. And this is something I'd kind of promised before. I hint at it in the original book on the historicity of Jesus, where I voice my suspicion that Docetism, which is this belief that there was a group of Christians who thought Jesus had a ministry in Galilee, but it was all an illusion, like it was like a fake ghost Jesus, or whatever, various different versions of this. And that this is used to explain away a lot of the evidence for mythicism. And I suspected that this is a modern anachronism, that it doesn't exist. There's no evidence of this actually ever being a Christian belief, and that in fact it has concealed evidence for the mythicist sect of Christians that we would suspect existed at some point. Now, I did a blog on this, and I said, if I were going to do this in a proper write-up, I would do a thorough document research, thorough database research of all the literature on this and go through it all. Well, I did that. So I completed the proper study, and it is now a whole chapter in the book on this, and my conclusions are pretty well proved there. Docetism is a modern fabrication. It did not exist in antiquity, and that has serious consequences for this debate. And then chapter 8 is chapter 8, 9, and 10. Those are the three remaining arguments where basically all the debate surrounds now. And I'm not going to get into that, but those are the three passages or pieces of evidence that I think the debate about the historicity of Jesus comes down to in the end. Once you've boiled away all the stuff that doesn't really hold up on examination, and I'll get into some reasons why it doesn't, these are the three things that you have to deal with. And so what I do is I devote a chapter to each one, and I explain where the state of the argument is now that we've had arguments made pro and con and so on. We've had 10 years to hash this out. Where are we now in these arguments? And so that's what those chapters will do. And then chapter 11 is where we will go from, or where we need to go from there, which is about why this is important. And that's why I chose the title of this book, The Obsolete Paradigm of Historical Jesus. And I talk about this in chapter 11. And the point being is that we're doing the wrong things and we're looking for the wrong things. The entire field of Jesus studies is off on a false mission, essentially, trying to find the historical Jesus when what we should be doing is looking for the actual roots of Christian origins and actually trying to understand, for example, the Gospels as mythologies, rather than as trying to extract history from them, try to understand why did the authors write the stories that they wrote the way they did. And this changes the way we understand biblical history, that changes what sort of work we should be doing. It changes the way we should be engaging the texts. It changes what we should be doing with the Gospels. So it has a huge impact on the field. And so resisting this conclusion is actually significantly damaging to the progress in Jesus studies. And so that's actually what chapter 11 deals with. So that's the gist of this new book. Now, what are the two arguments, the two chapters I left out? So here they're in the middle. Chapter 5, why historians simply must learn math. It's no way to avoid this. We've got to have this conversation. We got to sit down and talk about it. And then chapter 6, I apply everything from chapter 5, and I talk about the mathematics of historical and mythical people. When we argue for someone existing or not existing, no matter whether we are aware of it or not, we are making a mathematical argument. And so we really do need to be aware of that so that we can understand whether our argument is sound and valid. And so I actually apply this to examples of historical people, mythical people. How do we know someone's mythical? How do we know someone's historical? And then apply that to Jesus, of course, would be the next step. Now, the significance of chapter 5 is that in my original methodological study, Proving History, I focused on the long form, the full equation, Bayes' theorem. I was told earlier, didn't believe it, but since I've come to realize and learn that the odds form is much more intuitive for ordinary people to understand. And so I think, and that is what I ultimately used on the historicity of Jesus. So now I'm devoting a chapter to explaining that method in as 6th grade terms, basically. It's very simple. Of why the method works and what the method is and so on in its most basic format, which is the odds form of Bayes' theorem, which is something I'm going to teach you today. So let's get to that. All right, so here's Bayes' theorem in the odds form in the most formal sense. This is a complete formal version of the odds form. Now, this looks like Chinese, Russian, looks like all Greek to you, I'm sure. But really, it just means this. The final odds equals the prior odds times the likelihood ratio. That's Bayes' theorem in a nutshell. Just those three things. And that's it. Like if you can master those three things, you can do the method on anything, any fact claim in the world. Now, the prior odds, it's a mathematical way of measuring what usually happens in similar cases. It's basically the role of the prior odds. But then the likelihood ratio is asking a different question, which is, well, let's look at the specific evidence in this specific case. How likely is that evidence if the claim is true? And how likely is that same evidence if the claim is not true and something else caused that evidence? And that's, you build a ratio between those two probabilities, and that's the likelihood ratio. So you have the prior odds times the likelihood ratio. The end result is the final odds, which will be ultimately get you to the probability that your claim is true, whatever that claim may be. So all of this is based on given everything we know about the world then and now. So we have to take into account background knowledge about how humans work, how literature was developed in antiquity, all of those kinds of things. They all matter to how we evaluate these probabilities. So if we look at it in sort of a generic form, the odds that a hypothesis, we'll call H the hypothesis, doesn't matter what it is, the odds that H is true equals the prior odds that H is true times the likelihood ratio. The likelihood ratio is also sometimes called the Bayes factor. You'll see that term used in the scientific literature, for example. And it's basically the likelihood of the evidence on H over the likelihood of the evidence on not H, something else being the case. And when you hear English phrases like that's implausible or that requires too many assumptions and so on, those are statements about the prior odds. When someone says it's plausible, they're making a statement about the prior odds. They might not be aware that they're talking prior odds, but they are making a mathematical statement. And you can actually frame what they're saying in mathematical terms. Likewise, if you see like this evidence is more likely if that's what happened, or this evidence is unlikely unless that's what's happened, these kinds of statements and all the versions of them are basically statements of the likelihood ratio. These are also mathematical statements. As soon as you say more likely, you're already doing math, so you might as well just admit it and get down to asking what math it is you're actually doing. So that's the basic idea. And what my argument has been is that this is always the engine under the hood. No matter what your method is, no matter what your approach is, no matter what your argument is, it's always underneath it. What's working, what's doing the logic is Bayes' theorem. It's how we all think, even when we don't know it. And that's every conversation about plausibility, expected evidence, strength of evidence, and so on, all comes down to Bayes' theorem. So the historicity of Jesus or anything else is the same question. How likely is it that he really existed or was made up? How likely is it? This is a statement of mathematics. It's a statement of probability. And that breaks down to how typical would that have been? How usual would someone like Jesus be a historical person or not? That's the prior odds. And then how likely is the evidence if that's what happened? How likely is the evidence if there was a Jesus? How likely is that same evidence if there wasn't a Jesus? Those two questions get you the likelihood ratio. And that's all we're doing. That's the mathematics underlying all historical reasoning in all fields on all subjects. And often it gets brought up, the Holocaust denialism often comes up here. Denying the historicity of Jesus is like denying the Holocaust, which is an absurd statement. And here's why. You can actually mathematically demonstrate that that is an absurd statement. So I'm going to here and show you the logical underlying engine behind why historians are convinced that the Holocaust actually happened. Now, here's the hypothesis. The Holocaust happened. That's H, right? So we want to know, what are the odds that that actually happened? And so you start with the prior odds. Genocides typically turn out to be real. There's not a lot of fake genocides in the historical record, the legitimate historical record. I'm going to say 3 to 1. That means out of every 4 claims of a genocide, one of them is false. And that's an absurdly generous statement to genocide deniers. But that's relevant because if we err as far as possible on their side and still get a result against them, then any correction of our conclusion, any change to this 3 to 1 to a more realistic number will only make our point stronger rather than weaker. So I'm gonna choose the weak argument, which is that it's at least 3 to 1 odds that a genocide claim is going to turn out to be true. Now we have the evidence, E. The evidence means thousands of documents, eyewitness testimonies, recovered artifacts. The evidence is vast. Modern historians are super lucky compared to ancient historians in terms of the vast quantity of information that they have accessible to them. Photographs, even the archaeology is much more thorough than we have. The government documentation is really impressive. The access to diaries and letters, the access to video recordings of actual people who were there talking about things, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, right? So that scale of evidence, all of that stuff, you would have to say, if the Holocaust didn't happen, you would have to say all of that evidence, thousands and thousands of pieces of evidence, would all have to be forged or fake in some way. So what is the probability of that? So the evidence is actually millions of times more likely to be what we find it if the Holocaust happened than if it didn't, because to propose that all of that stuff was faked, it requires such a massive amount of improbable events for which we have no evidence, that it's again, millions of times more likely that that's the state of the world we would be observing now if the Holocaust happened than if it didn't happen. If it didn't happen, we shouldn't be seeing this massive quantity of evidence that we have, this broad scale of evidence. So again, I'm going to be super generous to Holocaust deniers and say it's at least 10 million to 1. It's worse than that. for them, but let's just be as generous as possible. We can't be any more generous than this. The odds of all of this stuff coming to exist in any other way, 10 million to 1. So you do the math at the bottom left, you can see it's at least 30 million to 1 final odds that the Holocaust actually happened. And so that's how the math breaks down. And the thing is, when you look at E here, that's what we don't have for Jesus. So Jesus is not comparable to this at all. Nothing like the evidence for Jesus that we have for the Holocaust. So we don't get the same result. Also, Jesus is a different kind of thing than genocides, for example. But we'll get to that. Let's pick a more obvious example, cargo cults. So the original cargo cult occurred in Melanesia. It started slightly before World War II, but hit full steam during World War II. And they developed the belief that a magical man named John From, meaning John from America, came to their island and taught them all of this, the mysteries and secrets of their religion, and promised that there would be the resurrected dead of their ancestors would come flying in on fabulous ghostly ships and planes with magical cargo and so on. Hence the cargo cult is the name we give them. Now, we just happen to have, sheer luck, we just happen to have anthropologists on the island where this movement began when it began. So we actually have a scientific documentation of the beginning of this religion. We don't have that for Jesus. We didn't have scientists on the ground observing it spontaneously, accidentally, when it began. But when it began with a series, a sort of organic movement of multiple shamans receiving secret messages through telegraph poles. They would listen to telegraph poles with their ears up on them, and they would receive spirit world communications. And there was no single person leading the movement. It was just a sort of general movement. And then all of these ideas kind of got merged together into a single movement. And then within about 40 years, a hero was invented to be the one who brought all of this knowledge. Even though it didn't originate from him, it originated from a variety of people claiming spirit communications. There wasn't any John From, there wasn't any single individual who started the religion. But within 40 years, that's what they were preaching. They had a whole biography of John From and how he came to the island and dispensed all of this wisdom and so on. And that is their savior hero. John From is their version of Jesus in the cult. So given that all that information that we have, which we don't have for Jesus either on the other side of things, evidence here is dozens of documents, eyewitness testimonies, research histories. We have many other cargo cults. There's Tom Navy. There's a cult that worships Prince Philip, even though he never came to their island either. At least he's a real person, but he didn't do anything that they claim. Cargo cult saviors usually are made up. So I'll say one to two. So out of every 3 cargo cult saviors, we're going to say one is made up and the others are real. That's being very, or the other way around, that two are made up and one is real. That kind of matches the actual documented evidence that we have. But it's being generous again. So it's easy to beat these prior odds with good evidence. So if the evidence went the other way, it would swamp the 1 to 2 against entirely, and it wouldn't matter that we started against. So you look at the Bayes factor, the evidence. We have the anthropologists, we have all of the documentation, we have a well-documented course of how this religion evolved. The evidence is thousands of times less likely if John From, there was a real John From. We should have a lot more documentation of it. The evidence should look completely different than we have, but that isn't the case. So thousands to 1, I'll say at least 1 to 5,000. Plug that into the math, and you say at least 10,000 to 1 against, right? That there was a real John From. Now, these are very ballpark numbers. These are very vague and generous numbers, not trying to be precise, because you don't have to be precise here. We can err entirely on the side of caution and still see how the evidence plays out in the direction that we're talking about. So let's look at Jesus, the odds that Jesus existed. So in this case, it's in between the cargo cults and the Holocaust, right? So we have the evidence is scant. It's either vague or poor. It's late. It's all filtered through bias. The evidence is problematic, but we don't have the scientists sitting there at the beginning of the religion documenting the origin of it, so we don't have that good evidence. But we also don't have like the stuff that we have for the Holocaust either. We don't have either kind of evidence on either side of the equation. We just have a small amount of shitty evidence. That's what we've got for Jesus. So how do we work this out? Now, we know that Jesus fits in a particular category of people as ancient savior gods. They're usually made up. I'll say at least 1 to 2. So out of every 3 ancient savior gods, 1 will turn out to be real. That's super generous to reality. We have like a dozen of these guys, these savior guys, and they're all non-historical. So usually it's much less likely for someone to turn out to be real in this category. But we're going to be really generous to the historicity people. And so they can't argue it's any better than 1 to 2 here. That out of every 3 ancient savior gods, only one turns out usually to be real. So that's the best odds we can give, the prior odds that we can give Jesus. So we look at the base factor. How good is the evidence? Now, there's a lot of evidence, pro and con. It's weak, it's terrible. You go through the long process of analyzing it. You balance it all out. What do you end up with at the end? I'll say at best, this is, again, I'll emphasize that. It's about equally likely either way. The evidence could be explained it could be just as likely whether Jesus existed or not. And so I say roughly 1 to 1, equal odds. And then when you put that math together, the odds of Jesus existing can be no better than 1 to 2, meaning there's a 1 in 3 chance. Because you add 2 to 1, you get 3. And so that gives you 1 in 3 chance that there was a Jesus at best. And that's, again, at the best, most favorable way of looking at all the evidence. So this is how Bayes' theorem operates. And again, there's a lot of technicalities, a lot of like particulars that we're skipping over. I'm just trying to show you how the logic works. And if you want the details of how we get these things, how we find these odds, how we find these frequencies and so on, what evidence we're talking about, what are the details and problematic elements of them. All of that is what the studies deal with. But let's do a comparison example, Socrates. I already used this as an example in On the Historicity of Jesus. I revisit him in this new book where I do the actual math for Socrates. So if you want to see the Bayesian argument for the historicity of Socrates, it's going to be in the new book. There are basically 5 categories of evidence that we have for Socrates, not a single one of which do we have any example of the same evidence for Jesus. And so I'll go down the list. We know the names of many eyewitnesses who wrote books about Socrates, including at least 16 of his disciples, from whom many titles, paraphrases, and quotations survive. So we've got that. We don't have anything from any eyewitness of Jesus at all. 2 of them we actually have, Xenophon and Plato, written within a few years of his death, not a half a century later, and in his own country and language. People forget that all the evidence for Jesus is in a foreign land and a foreign language, not in the language of even the region that he lived in, supposedly. And it was written half a century later, 40 plus years later, is when the first time, just like John Frum, we only get to hear about Jesus decades after the fact as a definite historical person. When we look at the letters of Paul, for instance, which are already 20 years after the fact, they're much more vague than the Gospels, and they're difficult to establish that he's talking about any actual Galilean preacher. But we do have that for Socrates. We've got actual eyewitnesses. His own disciples wrote books about him, and legitimately. So we don't have that for Jesus. We do for Socrates. We also have eyewitness third-party account written in his lifetime. Aristophanes wrote the play The Clouds to make fun of Socrates. It was actually a satire of Socrates' school in Athens. So the entire thing is a comedy about Socrates, in which Socrates would have sat in the audience. So Socrates actually watched this play making fun of him in his own time. Now imagine if we had that, if we had a third party, like some pagan wanderer, some sort of wit, traveling Galilee who wrote a comedy play about this Jesus character he wrote about, or that he ran into. That would be tremendous evidence for Jesus. We don't have that. We do for Socrates. We don't have any kind of third-party accounts of Jesus. And many contemporaries attested to Socrates, from Aristotle to Theopompus. Many more names could be listed there. There are good examples given in the blog article, Was Socrates a Real Person by Donald Robertson. I just ran into that recently. It's a new article. It's really good. And John Ferguson's book, Socrates, a Source Book, goes into a lot of the evidence and stuff that we have for Socrates and don't have for Jesus. And then there are quotes from many historians using written sources from his own lifetime. So there was Idomeneus wrote On the Followers of Socrates. Diogenes Laertius wrote The Lives of the Philosophers, where he has a whole chapter on Socrates. Athenaeus wrote The Dinner Sages, where he quotes a lot of books about Socrates, like things by Idomeneus. But those historians that we have, either directly or in quotation, actually used materials, including government documents that we have quotations of from the time of Socrates, attesting to Socrates. So those are actually much better histories than we have anything comparable to for Jesus. So Jesus has none of these things. Socrates has all of these things. Now you can do some math here. So, and again, I'm going to be super generous to Socrates deniers in this case and say that the evidence of, let's say for the first thing up there, the fact that we would know the names and have quotations from the books written by 16 of his disciples, I'll say that that evidence is twice as likely if he existed than if he didn't. It's really like 5 or 10 times more likely, but let's be super generous to the deniers of Socrates. It's at least twice as likely that we would have that if he existed than if he didn't. And we'll go down the list that we would have Xenophon and Plato, the actual eyewitness reports themselves of actual disciples. I'll say twice as likely, and so on down the list. So if we keep doing that, each one of these different pieces of evidence accumulates. So you add that all up. See, we're doing the odds 2 to 1 times 2 to 1 times 2 to 1 times 2 to 1. You get a Bayes factor of 32 to 1. Okay, so that's pretty good evidence for Socrates. So let's look at this. The odds that Socrates existed. The evidence is numerous eyewitness testimonies, both surviving and in quotation, and all of that other stuff that I mentioned. Unmiraculous philosophers. Now remember, Socrates is not a miracle worker. He's not a savior hero. He's not a mythological being. He's just a normal, ordinary philosopher. He didn't do anything special other than say cool shit. So unmiraculous philosophers, when you look at those as a category of people, they usually are not made up. In fact, they're rarely made up. And so I'd say like at least 5 to 1. So out of every 6 unmiraculous philosophers from antiquity, maybe one of them was made up. Like, let's say Pythagoras, perhaps, would be an example, or one of the really, really, really old sages who predates the written record or something like that. But unmiraculous philosophers are usually not made up. They tend to be historical, unlike worship savior heroes, which tend not to be historical. So the prior odds favor Socrates in a way that they don't favor Jesus. Then we look at the Bayes factor. Evidence is at least 32 times more likely if he existed. Remember, I just did that math for you. It's at least 32 to 1. It's actually worse than that, but it's at least that. So if you add that together, you get the math on the bottom left. Then you end up, it's over 100 to 1, 160 to 1 that odds that Socrates existed. 160 to 1 that he existed. That's pretty good odds. It's better than 99%. So we're pretty sure Socrates existed. And that's why, in point of fact, historians are sure Socrates existed. Even though they're not aware of the math, they're not doing the math in their head, they're intuitively trying to guesstimate the math in their head. They're coming to the conclusion it's very unlikely that Socrates didn't exist, given all of this evidence. And so if you want to analyze why that reasoning is sound, it's the math I'm doing right here. This is the hidden math, the underlying engine of all historians' thinking right here. So when we get to Jesus, the questions hinge around what's in the epistles. The questions hinge around, do we trust anything in the Gospels and so on. I'm not going to talk about any of that here today. They have their own problems, and I've done other talks on those separately. And of course, it's all covered in my books. So if you want to go into it there. What I'm going to go into more today, because I've given an example of Socrates where we have all this extra biblical evidence, the equivalent of extra biblical evidence, because Socrates didn't write anything. And there's no Bible. There was no institution hell-bent on establishing the existence of a Socrates and creating a rule of life around him or anything like that. But here's the equivalent stuff. It's all this external evidence of people who weren't necessarily Socrates's promoters, but some who were, but some who weren't, and so on. So it's similar to the extra biblical evidence. What exists outside the Bible? What exists outside Christian propaganda? And that's what I'm going to focus on today. And here we get into some basic principles of history that also have a Bayesian explanation, even when historians don't realize it. The first rule is that dependent sources are as likely to exist whether Jesus did or didn't exist. They're therefore useless. They have no mathematical effect. And here's why. For example, we have Celsus, this critic of Christianity. It's the first critic of Christianity to publish against Christianity. Around 160 AD, give or take. His work doesn't survive. Christians didn't preserve it, but it survives in the polemical quotations of Origen, a Christian philosopher, around 230 AD. But what those quotations show is that Celsus relied entirely on the Gospels. He had no other information about Jesus. He had no other sources for Jesus. He found no other attestations of Jesus, only the Gospels. That was his only source of information. So the probability that we would have the information in Celsus talking about Jesus, given Jesus existed and given the Gospels existed, which we know they did because he's quoting them, equals 1, because it's a 100% chance that that if the Gospels existed and Jesus existed, Celsus would be talking about the Gospels, talking about Jesus. 100% guarantee that would happen, so we're not surprised by that. But when we look at the other probability, the other side of the likelihood ratio, the probability that Celsus would say all those same things if Jesus didn't exist, but the Gospels still did. Well, that's also 100% because Celsus is just relying on the Gospels. He has no other independent evidence that Jesus existed. He's just assuming that the Gospels are recording a person existed. So the probability that we would have Celsus given the Gospels is also 100%. So the Bayes factor, the likelihood ratio for Celsus as evidence, is 1/1, producing no change in the probability that Jesus existed, because 1/1 is 1. Anything multiplied by 1 stays the same. So Celsus gives us no evidence for the historicity of Jesus. What it leaves us with is that the question reverts to the probability of the Gospels, the probability that they would exist and contain the contents that they do if Jesus existed or not. But that's no longer extra biblical evidence. Now we're back to Christian propaganda. We're looking at the Gospels. And so, yes, you got to look at the Gospels as evidence. Is it evidence? Is it not evidence? You have to address that. But Celsus doesn't add anything to it. So we can just throw Celsus away. He doesn't help us increase or decrease the probability that Jesus existed. So by contrast, let's look at Socrates as an example. I mentioned Diogenes and Athenaeus. They both attest to Socrates, but they relied on other named sources, from eyewitnesses like Xenophon and Plato to researchers like Idomeneus and Favorinus, which is another author that I didn't mention earlier. But to give you an example, there's a Melitone charging document. We actually have a quotation of basically the indictment against Socrates that resulted in his eventual execution. We actually have the text of it recorded. It was recorded at least as early as Favorinus. He got it obviously from someone before him. We don't know who. And it was quoted by Diogenes, and that's how we have it. We have Diogenes as quoting Favorinus, and he says, as Favorinus records, here's the document, I'm quoting it, yada, yada. The only probability that matters here is the probability that the quoted document is authentic. That Favorinus and Diogenes repeat what it says, that doesn't add anything as evidence. It's all we're concerned about is that document authentic? There's actually good reasons to believe that it is, and it's much better evidence for Socrates than we have for Jesus. We have nothing like the indictment against Jesus in a realistic legal format. But again, the point here is that it doesn't matter really whether, if how many people, Favorinus, Diogenes, Athenaeus, how many people quote this document. It's just the document that we're only interested in. That the probability of that document is it. That's the only thing that matters. Everything else is just copies of that, and that doesn't really help us determine anything. It doesn't increase the probability of Jesus existing, or Socrates existing in this case. And then there's Xenophon and Plato. We actually have those documents. So the only probability that matters is the probability of their contents, given that Socrates did or didn't exist. That Diogenes and Athenaeus also later quote them, that adds nothing as evidence for Socrates, because we actually have Xenophon and Plato. Diogenes and Athenaeus just repeating them doesn't add anything. So most extra biblical evidence is useless. It doesn't add anything to the historicity of Jesus. What we want is what we need, and we need it. Otherwise, we have to give up on this quest. Is what we need are independent sources, not dependent sources. So the question is, do we have any of those? So here's an example. Mara bar Serapion. There's a letter written by a certain Mara bar Serapion that mentions Jesus vaguely. It's sometimes cited as an independent source for Jesus, but that's never been established. The letter is vague, it's undatable, it cites no sources, and its author is unknown. So they could easily be relying on the Gospels and just including that information in their letter. So it is not an independent source. So it's useless. We just throw it in the trash. We can't do anything with it. It doesn't tell us anything about increasing the probability that Jesus existed or not. Now, on top of that, and here's where my book comes in question or into play, is that there have been new developments on this since I talked about it. I already wrote Mara bar Serapion off as irrelevant evidence because it's not independent evidence in my original study. But since then, there's actually been really solid demonstrations in the academic literature that the letter itself of Mara bar Serapion is actually a Christian school exercise from the 4th century AD, and therefore really isn't of any use as evidence. It's late, it's Christian, it's post-gospel, it adds no data whatsoever. It's also fiction. It's a fake letter someone wrote in school. So it's useless, basically. And then that kind of information about the developments in the field is one of the things that my new book is going to tag on for a lot of these things. But that's an example that Mara Serapian is not independent. We can't prove that he's independent, so we can't use it as evidence. And for those who are interested in exploring that, here's some of the authors who've written about it. Margaret Williams, Kathleen McVeigh, more particularly, that's this probably the most important discussion. And she's written other studies prior to this, but that's her summary. And then Catherine Chin independently came to similar conclusions earlier. So that you look at all of that literature, and that's how you'd find out that Mara Serapian is a useless piece of evidence because it's a Christian school exercise from the 4th century and therefore not independent. Okay, so let's get to more substantial examples. Suetonius, you'll often hear Suetonius cited. Problem is that whatever Suetonius says is garbled and useless. There's no evidence he even referred to Jesus, much less did so independently of Christians citing the Gospels. So even if you believe Suetonius mentioned Jesus, and it's unclear that he did, in fact, it probably didn't, but it's vague and useless information. So even if he did, though, there's no evidence establishing that it's independent of Christians citing the Gospels. So Suetonius is not independent. People will cite Thalos and Phlegon. There's actually no evidence they referred to Jesus. There's evidence that they didn't, that actually that was a mistake that someone later made. Thalos and Phlegon don't talk about Jesus at all. There's Pliny the Younger. Problem with Pliny the Younger is he never mentions Jesus as historical. He only talks about him as a worshipped being. But also Pliny relied on Christian sources. He says so well after the Gospel circulated. So Pliny the Younger, even if he had mentioned Jesus as historical, would afford no evidence for us that he existed because he's just relying on the Gospels through Christian intermediaries. Then you'll hear the Talmud cited. Well, the Talmud is centuries later than the Gospels, so it's clearly not independent. There's no cited sources, and it places Jesus 100 years earlier than the Gospels and records him being stoned, not crucified, and nowhere near Jerusalem. So clearly, whoever's writing the story in the Talmud has no reliable sources, so that can't help the historicity of Jesus. So this is an example of how bad the evidence is. Compare all of this to what we have for Socrates. It's night and day in terms of what we've got. So that leaves two important pieces of evidence. Tacitus. Tacitus writes around 116 AD, but he simply replicates the standard Christian creed decades after the gospel circulated. He cites no source. Most likely, however, his source is Pliny the Younger, who interrogated Christians. Therefore, his source is probably Christians, probably citing the Gospels. So even if Tacitus wrote what he wrote this material, it's not independent, so we can't use it. There's also, I'll put as an aside, there's also considerable evidence Tacitus did not write that line. He appears originally to have written about a different group, and an accidental or deliberate gloss by a later Christian scribe entered the text and made it about Jesus. You can have that debate separately. It's a whole other issue. Again, I have a Bayesian argument for it. The evidence is pretty strong, but even if you reject it, it doesn't matter. You're still left with the fact that even if it wasn't an interpolation, what Tacitus says there cannot be established to be independent of the Gospels. It's therefore useless as evidence. That leaves us with Josephus. This is the last author to consider. He wrote The Antiquities of the Jews in the 90s AD. And there's two passages in Josephus that might refer to Jesus. One is a little glowing paragraph, sort of Christian propaganda that appears in Josephus, and another is sort of a casual aside that I'll get to in a moment. Josephus, now the glowing passage, the propaganda paragraph, it closely replicates the Emmaus material in the Gospel of Luke. This has been demonstrated under peer review, which demonstrates that he had no other source but the Gospels. So even if Josephus wrote that, he's not independent of the Gospels. In fact, he's clearly relying on the Gospels as a direct source and slavishly copying them. So that's no use as evidence, right? So then we get to the other thing. Of course, we think that passage wasn't written by Josephus at all. That it was written by Christians for a variety of reasons. But even if it wasn't, is the point. Even if it wasn't written by Christians, even if it was written by Josephus, it's not independent, so it's not usable as evidence. So that gets us to one last piece of evidence, which is two words elsewhere linking an executed James to Jesus. Someone named James links him to Jesus. That those two words, I have argued under peer review, appear to be an accidental interpolation. And that clause was never there originally. So let's do some Bayesian analysis of this. So Tacitus and Josephus, actually recent work since I published has confirmed all of my observations and made them stronger. And so I actually point this out and document it and discuss it in the new book. Historians keep holding out for other explanations, but they do so only against a mountain of evidence at this point. There's just no respectable reason to be holding against the conclusions here. I do give a full analysis in Josephus on Jesus, why you can't cite opinions before 2014. I keep that article updated to cover all of this. But what I do is I do a sort of academic version of that in the book. In the book, I'll just summarize recent studies and why they disprove all attempts to resist them. But that shows the development since I published has gone more in the direction that I was already going. Important articles. G.J. Goldberg, he's the one who proved the Testimonium Flavianum, which is that glowing propaganda paragraph, that derived from the Gospel of Luke. It can't possibly have derived independently of Luke. So this entails it is not independent, therefore it's useless, even if Josephus wrote it. That's not the conclusion Goldberg wants to come to, but it is nevertheless mathematically the case. Ken Olson has proved through multiple articles that the vocabulary of the passage is closer to the style of Eusebius than to Josephus. This implies Josephus did not write it. Either Eusebius forged it or his tutor and predecessor Pamphilus forged it. It could be either one of them. But most importantly, and this is probably the most important article that came out on this subject since I published, is Paul Hopper, who did a brilliant discourse analysis, which he showed that the structure, the way that Josephus uses to tell stories, and all the other stories he tells in all of his other books, he has a particular model of the way he tells stories, how he provides information, how he gives a causal narrative, and so on. Hopper shows that the Testimonium Flavianum, this glowing propaganda paragraph, does not match Josephine discourse style in any way at all. And not only that he shows that all the attempts by historians to remove the things they don't like from it and claim that there was a shorter paragraph that Josephus wrote that Christians then added material to or changed things in, that argument is also conclusively disproved by Hopper, because all of those new fabricated hypothetical versions of the paragraph are even less like Josephine discourse style. So they're moving the text even further away from what Josephus would have written had he actually written it. And so that's the death knell as far as I'm concerned. This passage is done for. Hopper pretty much killed it. So that leaves the James passage that I hinted at. This is Josephus, Jewish Antiquities, book 20, 200. Ananus the Cruel illegally executes, quote, the brother of Jesus, the one called Christ, whose name was James, and some others. There's a whole story that Josephus tells about this, but it only mentions Jesus in the one called Christ, that one little aside. There's no other reference to Christianity, Jesus, or anything else. Now, the clause, the one called Christ, is just 3 words in Greek, to legomenu Christou, the one called Christ. Even if Josephus wrote those words, again, this is coming back to the independence issue, the probability is low that he knew Christians regarded themselves to be the brothers of Christ. This is actually a fundamental Christian doctrine. Paul writes about it repeatedly. Baptized Christians are the adopted sons of God and therefore co-heirs with Jesus. So Jesus is the firstborn of many brethren. So all baptized Christians are brothers of the Lord. So if a story came down to Josephus that James, the brother of the Lord, was executed, well, Josephus would have no idea that didn't mean biologically. So since Josephus cites no source for this information, we can't demonstrate it to be independent of Christian claims to fictive brotherhood. It therefore does not reliably attest a biological brother of Jesus. We have no information in here that shows that Josephus understood that there was a difference between biological brothers and fictive brothers of Jesus. That means it's useless as evidence, even if Josephus wrote it. Now, he almost certainly did not. And here's a huge list of types of evidence. I'm not going to go into this. Let's see. I've been speaking now for about 50 minutes. So I'm going to wrap here by quickly tying this up. But you could take a look at this, take a picture of this slide. But it contains information that is in my book. It's also in the article that I referred you to already. So you have access to this stuff, just written differently than this. But you can look at all of these pieces of evidence and do the same kind of analysis, where I think it's 10 times more likely that this piece of evidence would be there if he didn't write it, 5 times more likely that this piece of evidence would be there if he didn't write it, and so on. We can go through each piece of evidence and each particular thing and do the same analysis, and I get a Bayes factor of 156,250 to 1. So hundreds of thousands to one against this being something that Josephus wrote. You can go in here and do the math. Now here, the prior odds actually favor this being authentic. Interpolations are admittedly uncommon. Very generous ratio would be 1,000 to 1 against. So that means every 1,000 passages are authentic, one will be interpolated. So 1,000 to 1 against this, what I'm arguing. But the base factor is 156,000 the other way. So if you do the math, it actually comes down to 1 to 15,625. So well over 10,000 to 1 odds. Josephus didn't write it, even given the fact that interpolations are rare. And so that's the kind of thinking, that's the reasoning that's going on. This just shows what the brain is doing when we actually make these arguments and why it logically follows. Again, the numbers are intentionally vague and are meant to be as much against our conclusion as possible so that they can't be gainsaid. So I'm going to stop the presentation there and take questions now that I've summarized some aspects of the new book, and particularly the Bayesian methodology and extra biblical evidence. And I think David's got the room for the first questions, if any.
Hi, Dr. Terry. Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
First of all, thanks for taking the time to be with us today. The presentation, I was very well received by me. I think you really are onto something with the, basing things on Bayes, even if I think, to me, a big value of that is the fact that someone can interrogate the way you weigh the evidence. And I think there's just too little of that going on right now.
Absolutely. That's an important point, and it's a point that I make in the book that I think keeps getting lost. Like, people will focus on, well, you just made up 156,000, you just made that number up. No, I didn't really make it up per se. Every assumption that leads to that number is, as you say, interrogatable. You can question it, and you can actually talk about, well, okay, if you think the number is different, why do you think the number is different? And more importantly, what information do you need to present to make that number different? And that's where I get into, like, how do we figure out how frequent certain kinds of outcomes are given certain kinds of inputs? And that actually relates to how we determine these things. And I go into that in more detail in the book. So give people specific ways of questioning and interrogating and even correcting or changing numerical values that I or anyone else assign to these things.
So my question would be, like, I'm kind of interested to know how that looks at a sort of a detailed level. Like, I think, so I'm sure you're well familiar with Galatians 1:19, where Paul said, but I did not see any other apostle except James, the Lord's brother. That's what it's translated as in the NRSV.
Yeah.
You maybe would probably disagree with that translation if I'm not mistaken. But I think you've given that passage, whatever it is in Greek, as something like 2 to 1 odds in favor of James being the biological brother of Jesus. And I was wondering, like, how do you derive that?
Yeah, for everyone in the chat, I'm linking an article as an URL I'm throwing in the chat on the side. That's the article I've written about, basically answering your question on this.
Okay.
So there's two aspects to this. One is why, so I have two, so I have margin of error in the book. So I have the margin that I think is correct, and then I have the margin I think is that I can most reasonably agree with, that's most against my conclusion as possible. And that's the side. It's the side against me that I think is the one that I assign a 2 to 1 in favor. So I still count this as evidence for the historicity of Jesus at the outside. I think that's the at best probability. I actually think it's the other way around, that it's actually very terrible evidence and doesn't have that effect. But I have to allow for error, right? So I could be biased, I could be mistaken, and I have to allow for some amount of my error. So I allow as much error as possible, and the most that I can reasonably allow is that 2 to 1. How I come to it is the basic idea that even if we set aside all of, and this, oh, by the way, this is also something I discuss in the book. So I actually go into this aspect of it, which is that if we didn't know, if we had no evidence that Christians all regarded themselves as brothers of the Lord, and if we didn't have the weird grammar, the grammar gets hidden by the English translations. There are actually the certain English translations today by major translation societies agree with me on translating this. So I'm not someone who's just coming along with his own idiosyncratic translation. I'm actually following the peer-reviewed literature and a debate that occurred there, which is discussed in the article that I linked in the chat. And several translation committees have agreed with that conclusion, is that the grammar, Paul's grammar, is particularly convoluted and weird there. And when we look at other models of that particular kind of grammar elsewhere in Greek literature, it means something different than has been translated. The usual translations are based on Christian faith assumptions about what Paul is talking about, rather than looking closely at the actual Greek grammar that Paul used. And that's why I think the paradigm issue is so important. That's why it's an obsolete paradigm. If you look at it through this lens of assuming Paul is talking about all the faith assumptions that Christians have, you come to the wrong conclusions, and you miss the fact that there is actually really weird grammar structure here that we really should have been paying more attention to. Whereas if we abandon all the assumptions of historicity, we wouldn't have skipped that. We would have noticed that. And so, in fact, it would actually change the way we do research, and it would change the results we get in a lot of other aspects, including the fact that this means that the James in Galatians 1 is not an apostle, which means he can't be the James in Galatians 2. That's a huge, important result in terms of understanding Paul's history of himself and the people he interacted with across those two chapters. So there's a lot of effect here, even apart from the debate whether Jesus existed or not. There's significant differences in how we understand early Christian history result from whether you adopt the historicity paradigm or abandon it. But
So
what I
just-
come down to is, I'm sorry, let's just quickly resolve what I'm getting to. I know I'm wandering, but I do the fact that there's all this evidence. If we didn't have that, if we didn't have the evidence of the weird grammar, if we didn't have the fact that the well evidence fact from Paul himself that Christians regarded themselves as brothers of the Lord, then that passage in Galatians would be really strong evidence. I would measure it 10 or even 100 to 1 in favor of the historicity of Jesus, because then like there are no other plausible, like we could invent reasons for that, but there's no evidence for those reasons, so the reasons remain improbable. So what changes when you look at the evidence is that we do have that stuff. We have the weird grammar. We have the evidence that Christians regarded them as brothers of the Lord. That completely changes the probability that we assign to this thing. So I think even at best, we can't give it any more than 2 to 1 in favor of historicity of Jesus. And that's being outrageously generous to the historicity argument.
That makes sense. Thank you for explaining.
Good question. And really touches on what I'm doing in the next book and why it's important, because it really hits those kinds of questions for a particular reason. Do we have anything else?
I have more questions if no one else does.
Does Zoom have hand raising? I can't remember how that works. We have people remotely.
Whoa, can you hear me?
Yes, Peter.
Oh, great. Hi. I have a question. I think we agree that among the Gospels, Mark is the earliest, and Matthew, Luke, John, and many, many others were basically derived from Mark, or at least were related to Mark, commentaries or corrections or something like that. It almost seems to me that Mark, just to read it as a story is packed start to finish with unbelievable assertions.
Yeah.
It's full of supernatural and very unlikely events. And it just seems to me that it was written for the educated reader at the time to infer as myth and allegory, from the start, instead of trying to derive a biography of Jesus from the Gospel of Mark. It's really, a signal of flag waving, saying, look, this didn't actually happen. You're supposed to just like, tortoise and hare. Tortoises and hares don't have conversations.
Yeah.
And lay bets against each other, so there's a moral lesson behind it, and you're not supposed to figure out what route they took, or
right. No, I totally agree with you, and of course that's the argument I make extensively in the original study. I talk a little bit more about it in the new book, where I use an example from the Gospel of Luke because it became a point of debate later. So the Gospel of Luke, there's this story about the two swords, and I wrote a blog about it, so people can find on my blog the two swords. I think I had a sort of snarky title for the article, but can you have a revolution with two swords, or something like that? So this is this saying where Jesus says, whoever whoever has a cloak or whatever should now pick up a purse, and whoever doesn't should sell their cloak and buy a sword. Right. And then the disciples say, here are 2 swords. And Jesus says, that's enough. And then they move on. And it's like, the story makes no sense as history. Like, there's no way this ever happened. Like the conversation is completely unintelligible as a real event. And no matter what way you analyze it. But there literally historians are arguing over whether the conversation actually happened and whether the swords were swords or knives that were shown. It's like it's a ridiculous conversation. And what I show is, like, actually, if you look at it as allegory in terms of symbolism and in context, particularly in its context, you can explain every detail of it as just a message about a message that they want Jesus to have made. They weren't trying to describe an actual conversation. They don't want you to figure out whether it was a knife or a sword. Like, that's not missing the point entirely of the whole thing. The point was a lesson about, it's actually a pun in the sense that people who have understanding will now start collecting for the mission. And people who don't have understanding are the fools who will take up swords, and they're the ones who don't get it. And they say the 2 swords, it actually connects to another 2 swords narrative, which was regarding an Old Testament story in which these 2 heroes took up 2 swords and killed a whole bunch of their enemy in revenge. And yet in the Bible, they're punished for this. It's a sin because they made a treaty with those people and they broke the treaty. So they broke an oath, they engaged in violence, and they got punished by God for it. And that 2 swords narrative is echoed in a lot of different places. It was actually a hot topic when Luke was writing. Like, it was being discussed by rabbis and Jews of the time. And most of the trend of the thought at the time was to reinterpret the Old Testament to make them into heroes. Like, they're Israelite heroes. They went and killed everybody with their 2 swords. That makes them great and mighty, and so on. And Luke is writing having Jesus criticize that. And you see that immediately in the next scene when the disciples who have the swords that showed him the swords attack. They engage in attack to try and ward off the guards who come to arrest Jesus. And Jesus has to stop them and say, no, stop. Right? That's enough. Right? It's the same kind of thing going on. Jesus is criticizing the use of violence. The use of violence is the wrong way to understand his message. So it's all this sort of allegorical understanding. And you'll miss this brilliant, when you look at its structure, it's brilliant. What Luke did, the changes he made to the story that he inherited from Mark to fit this little story in and tie it all together is just genius as a writer. And you can see that the way that he did it and stuff. It's quite impressive. But if you're arguing over whether it was an actual conversation and it was whether it was a knife or a sword, and whether it was actually 2 or 100, right? Like, you're completely missing the point of what Luke was doing. And we're not understanding this piece of literature at all when we do that. And so I think that we have to change our paradigm and look at it the way that you're talking about it, which is like, we need to look at this as mythology, stop trying to find the history in it, because these writers are not even attempting to reconstruct history, even when they're trying to sell it as history. Like, after Mark, you get Matthew actually makes it more historical by talking about the things happening, fulfilling scriptures. And then Luke actually frames it as a history with a fake preface about how he did all this research, right? And then John actually says, you're damned if you don't believe this is literally true. But as you keep going on, like, they're making up more and more stuff, right? So it's becoming less, they're trying to make it more, they're trying to sell it more and more as history. But they're not actually doing history. They're making stuff up, right? So the ideology changes over time as to how they wanted to sell this story. But it began not as a history. It began as just a system of messages to preach the gospel with. It wasn't really intended to, like, argue that there was an actual historical Jesus walking around Galilee. That was actually meant to be what the people who don't get it would think. The insiders who get it would understand the real meaning. And that's in Mark 4. For people who read Mark 4, there's a part where Jesus says about the parables. Like, outsiders I tell in parables so they won't understand, but insiders I'll tell you the real thing. And the real thing, of course, is not to take the parables literally, right? And so if you think of that, that's Mark cluing in the audience as to his whole gospel. He wants the audience to figure out that this whole gospel is a parable. And you're supposed to use the same key that he has Jesus give the disciples in Mark 4 to interpret the whole gospel, not just the parables that Jesus preaches. There's a good book on this called The Gospel as Parable, or Power of Parable, written by John Crossan. And he shows that this is a style of writing used by a lot of authors at the time. It's not just a Christian device. But it is the sort of thing that people were taught in school to compose, and these authors of the Gospels went to school for sure. They learned how to compose Greek. So he shows that it fits right in that context, that we should understand the Gospels as extended parables with Jesus as the character, and not as histories. And I think there's a lot of trend this way. Walsh and some other authors are coming out arguing that we need to treat this literature as literature and not as some sort of biography, like historically researched biography and so on, or preservation of oral lore. Like even that's coming into question. There's a lot of fashion now for just assuming that there's oral lore that goes back to Jesus that's somehow being recorded by the Gospels. But there's recent pushback by some peer-reviewed scholars who are saying that we're doing the wrong thing by just assuming there's oral lore. This is just, de novo literary creation. There is no oral lore that they're relying on at all. And so there's several scholars who've argued that since I published. So it's another example of the trend line going in my direction, the direction that I predicted. And I document that and talk about it in the new book.
Right. Yeah, I was very pleased to hear about the new book and what you're putting into it. I basically what I meant by my question, or what I was leading up to,
Okay.
was
Yeah.
where do you, if you agree with me, which you do,
Yeah.
how do you see the religion developing to the historical model of Jesus and the biographical model of the earliest Gospels? I mean, it's you think, for example, Matthew didn't believe any of that stuff really happened either, right?
Yeah, right.
And although he's, like you say, using the example of, saying this happened to fulfill prophecy, sort of implies that he's really trying to persuade us that it happened.
Yeah,
But do you think
I think so.
believe it?
Matthew, it's hard to read what Matthew's doing. I do think Matthew is still pushing Mark's insider-outsider discourse. So I think Matthew is just dressing it up to look more like history, specifically to fool the outsiders and to make insiders more informed, right? By the time you get to Luke, I think Luke is trying to hit both markets. I think he has a market that he wants to convince this is true, and he has a market that he knows he'll never convince it is true, but he wants them to understand that it's all parable. It's only John. John is the first gospel, and I should say our redaction, which is the last redaction of John, not the original redaction of John, but the one that we have. That one has all those statements about, like, the doubting Thomas, where, like, blessed is he for who saw this, but even more blessed are those who believe this happened who didn't see it. Right? Like, there's actual statements there saying, like, no, you really need to believe that this really happened.
Right.
Which tells us two things. Like, no one else before John is saying this, not even John, because the original redactions didn't say this, but he has to say this. So you have to think about this, like, why did John have to do that unless he's arguing against people who've been saying you're not supposed to do this, right? So John is, like, explicitly arguing against the model that Mark was pushing from the beginning. And so you see the evolution from Mark to John. The church's perspective is changing. It's like, okay, we need to get rid of this idea that it's not historical. That's dangerous for us. We need to start selling this as historical, and here's particular reasons why. So there are several authors who've written about this. Kurt Knoll, for example, have discussed how this tends to happen. The John Frum narrative and the cargo cults is an example of how it becomes vitally important that John Frum is an actual historical person now, even though it wasn't when it began, right? Like the same evolution of historicizing as a means of authority creating is the same kind of thing going on in early Christianity. For those who are interested in that question, I don't talk about it in the new book because I put it's in Jesus from Outer Space. I have a whole chapter in there, which I call, let's see. Oh, how did Christianity switch to a historical Jesus? So that's chapter 7 of this book, where I outline what I think is going on. I talk about it a little bit in the new book, but I focus on different aspects of it in the new book, in particular the development of the creed, how it goes from Mark's creed to the historicized creed in Ignatius, where now you have to insist that it was Pontius Pilate who killed Jesus. Now you have to insist that people are actually witnesses to Jesus preaching the gospel in Galilee, right? So this kind of change in mindset, I treat that in my Docetism chapter, where I talk about how Docetism didn't exist. And then when we forget that when we finally get rid of Docetism as a concept and look at the texts again, we see a different phenomenon emerging there. We actually see arguments against mythicist Christians in the texts that we have, which actually becomes evidence, at least that sect existed. It's late evidence, so it doesn't really help us with the historicity of Jesus, but it does help us understand the development of the Christianity, and shows us that there were groups still sticking around that had to be argued against, that were arguing that, no, stop taking this stuff literally. It's not meant literally. But then you have people like John saying, no, you're damned if you don't take it literally. Come on. Like, that's the kind of, we have this debate going on, but we only get to see one side of the debate, right? All the other stuff got destroyed.
It reminds me of Second Peter, and off the top of my head, can't remember.
Yeah,
or what. I don't
you're
know
right.
when do you think that was written? And
well, I agree with most scholars that it's definitely 2nd century. Can't get more precise than that, but early to mid 2nd century probably.
so it's pretty early,
Well,
right alongside John, right?
Exactly. The last redaction of John around the same time, right? So their texts are very similar in what their mission is. The whole idea of attacking Christians claiming that it's a myth by inventing an eyewitness testimony to it being historical. That's something that you see in 2 Peter that you don't see in 1 Peter, which is interesting. And you don't see it anywhere else other than John.
Yeah, I don't want to dominate the Q&A. I just want to say that my Christian friends all know where I stand on this, but I just want them to become better Christians.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Oh, what the first Christians believed, what the source was before the Catholic Church got involved, and and kings and emperors and inquisitors and what have you. Let's get back and
so a bit of advice on that. So the chapter, and in fact, it's chapter 6 where I talk about the 2 swords story. And that's a chapter that you could give to a Christian.
Which book is this now?
This is the new book that's coming out, so it's not out yet. I can't tell you when it'll be out, sorry. But it's going through the motions. But no, it's better to read the version in the book. But I have an article on it on my blog, but it doesn't go into the aspects that I'm talking about now. But when you do this analysis and see the true meaning of it, the moral of the story becomes much more powerful. And I think that's, the Christians have to make a decision between what's more important. Is it more important that there actually were 2 disciples carrying 2 swords and Jesus actually said that was enough? Or is the moral message that Luke was trying to tell by that story, is that more important? And then if you decide, I want the moral of the story, I want to understand what kind of moral message Luke is conveying, there's actually stuff that really speaks to Christians and matches exactly what they want to hear. It matches the kind of things they've heard in preaching, the things that they've heard about what the purpose of the gospel in the world is, and so on, what true gospel and false gospel is. There's a lot there that they could benefit from, even within their own worldview, that they don't have to be atheists to get it, where they would, like you said, become better Christians. They would understand their own text better if they actually looked at it as mythology rather than as history.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Do we have any others? Yeah. Well, let's see if anybody else wants to go.
Daniel, you mentioned you had a few other questions.
Yeah, I would ask at least another question if no one else has a question at the moment.
I see a hand up. Aaron Adair.
Oh yeah, this is
I don't know if I see everybody. I can't tell.
Hello.
Oh, okay. Aaron, are you there?
Just quick mic check. Hearing me?
Yeah, I hear you. I just see your icon.
Yeah,
but I
no
hear you
video
fine.
for me at the moment. All
Yeah.
right.
Hi, by the way, hi, Aaron. Nice to hear from you.
Pleasure as always, yes. All right, so the question I'll have, I wanted to see what will be addressed in your new book relating to the back and forth that has happened in interpreting Romans 1:3 about the sperm of David, how
Right.
do we make a mythical Jesus consistent with that? Just because I often see when historicists respond to this, they treat your idea of the cosmic Spurg bank as basically a laugh line rather than a serious proposal. So
Yeah.
I know you talk a bit about some other evidence you had found in Jesus from Outer Space that's a bit later, but I don't know if you have anything additional to discuss interpreting that particular part of the letters of Paul.
Yeah, I do. So I add all the evidence that's been accumulated. One piece of evidence is in the 2023 revised edition of Historicity of Jesus, which is the angel Layla, which is an important proof of concept. And what I focus on is how people try to dismiss that evidence as late, but I'm not using it as predecessor evidence. I'm not using the evidence of precedent. I'm using the evidence of concept, which shows that rabbinical Jews just readily and without question assumed that angels are transporting sperm all over the place and bringing it to God and sending it back. And that's in the Talmud. And again, without any credulity, there's no one saying that's ridiculous. It doesn't happen. No, they just assume, yeah, of course, there's an angel Layla who takes everyone's sperm up to God and asks questions about it and then takes it back. You can laugh at it, but it's there. They actually said it. They actually believed it. This was a real belief back then. And then I bring in more aspects of the Zoroastrian precedent, which is a precedent of the magical lake that basically banked the sperm of Zoroaster so that virgins could be pregnated at the right prophetic time 1,000 years later by his magically preserved sperm in the lake. That's a precedent that actually exists in Zoroastrian writings. It probably predate Christianity. And we know Zoroastrianism influenced Judaism. So anyway, like the evidence is all, the laugh track aspect is ridiculous when you're ignoring the fact that this is a normal way that people thought back then. You're actually laughing at them, the ancients, rather than the idea. And I think that's what's going on there. But I also focus on the logic. And so I bring up the important aspect that we don't even have to buy the sperm bank thing. I actually say that there's good evidence for it, and that's the most likely explanation. It's a direct literal interpretation of scripture. They always love direct literal interpretations of scripture that require no hedging. So and it has great precedents and so on. So it's the best theory. But there are other theories. So like Paul says that Gentiles are the seed of Abraham. He doesn't mean literally. So if he says it's the seed of David, well, does he mean that literally or does it mean it metaphorically? We know Paul can speak metaphorically. So there's a lot of different ways to interpret the text. The only thing that matters is, would he say it if Jesus didn't exist or not? Regardless of what weird contraption he came up with to explain why he's saying it, would he have to say it anyway? And that's the thing that I think is the logic that people are missing, is that the prophecy of Nathan is one of the few explicit prophecies of the Messiah that therefore cannot be dodged. Your Messiah has to fulfill Nathan's prophecy, just has to. There's no Messiah can exist that does not fulfill Nathan's prophecy. So if you're already convinced that Jesus has undergone this cosmic death and resurrection to save the world, and you have to sell him as therefore the Messiah, you have to come up with some way that he fulfills Nathan's prophecy, which is that the seed comes directly from David's belly, etc. And once you understand that, then it doesn't really matter what theory Paul has in mind behind the text. He would have to say it anyway. Like, he can't not say it. He has to say Christ is the seed of David. Like, there's no other thing that he could do. So the probability that he would say that if Jesus didn't exist is 100%, completely regardless of what way Paul made that make sense. And of course, Paul doesn't tell us how he made it make sense. He doesn't even tell us the biological reasoning behind it. He just says it. He says, we just believe this. He doesn't give you any indication as to what he thinks the actual underlying cause of it is. Does he think it's biology? Does he think it's magic? Does he think it's metaphor? Paul doesn't say, and so we really can't interject that. All we can ask is, how likely is it that he would say what he does say? And the probability is 100% even if Jesus didn't exist. So the evidence can't even be used that way. It's pointless to laugh at the alternative explanations, because that's just laughing at the way that all ancient Jews reinterpreted scripture in bizarre ways to get it to fit strange things that it couldn't possibly make sense of otherwise. So you're just laughing at the Jews, really, and you're not laughing at the theory. In terms of the logic, there's no probability that Paul would have not said this, or not, even if he didn't write it in his letters, if you could go in a time machine and ask him, does Jesus fulfill the Nathan prophecy? And you say, oh, yes, he's the seed of David, and here's how I think it is. He would do that with 100% certainty, even if Jesus didn't exist in our sense. So it's important to understand the logic there, that there's no escaping the logic. You can't get this to be evidence for Jesus because Paul is too vague about what he means, because he has to say it regardless. And I think that's something that's been lost in the debate. And you can see it in the way that people have tried to respond to it in the literature since I published. But I also introduce a scholar who actually published another article. I don't have it right off the top of my head. I can't remember his name or anything, but I discuss another scholar's work where he's a hardcore believing Christian. So he has a fundamentalist view, but he's basically kind of supporting my view of the seed of David interpretation in his own way, in his own Christian way, but through a peer-reviewed medium of analysis. And he uses the same kind of argument that I do regarding Paul's choice of language, which is weird. And another thing that's an aspect of it and so on. So there's this will get addressed, and it will be updated significantly, and therefore an important contribution to the debate. So the book will matter for that.
Thank you. Just quick add on to that as well. We had some discussion as well on this. Did you find the stuff in Fourth Ezra one way or the other helpful? Because it seems to describe a pre-existent heavenly Davidic Messiah, and if he's pre-existent and Davidic,
Yeah,
it kind of makes that plausible.
I don't. I think I do. I give it a reference. The problem I have with 4 Ezra is the inability to untangle how much Christians have meddled with the text. So that makes it compromised evidence, and so I don't know what to do with it. I throw it in there, like so. Like if you want to do something with this, here's a footnote on it. But here's why I don't think I can do anything with it. What I do use though is the eternal Messiah. So there's the Talmudic story of the Messiah who's been alive forever, and is the beggar at the gate of Rome or whatever. This is actually well established. It's not only established in the literature, it's established in the scholarship I found. Like this is pretty much agreed upon by scholars who study this, and I cite several scholars who do, that this was a going Jewish belief, that the Nathan prophecy was fulfilled by there being a hidden son of David, not Solomon, but this other son who just lived forever and has been hidden all this time. And that's how they keep the seed prophecy true. So the people who don't know what we're talking about, Nathan's prophecy is that the seed taken directly from David's belly will sit an eternal throne. But of course that's false. So the prophecy is falsified by the fact that the throne is dissolved. It's not an eternal throne. And so there's a lot of different ways that you can reinterpret the passage that are very reaching, as most Christian interpretations are, and Jewish interpretations. They're sort of abusing the text to try and get it to say something that it doesn't. But this eternal, like this eternal son of David, like is a literal interpretation of the Nathan prophecy. It's saying, yeah, that guy is the actual, like came directly from the belly of David, and he will sit in the eternal throne eventually. He just won't die until then. He'll just be hanging around. He'll be a beggar at the gate of Rome, as the thing is, at the final, when the final bell rings or the final horn blows, and then he'll arise and be the Messiah and bring about the new age, and then he'll sit in the eternal throne. And that's literally the same thing as the sperm bank hypothesis. It just involves an eternally living human rather than an eternally living sperm cell. So that becomes relevant as proof of concept, that they're willing to think of absurd things to explain the Nathan prophecy, and that supports the argument importantly. Even if the theory is late, even if we can't establish that the eternal Scion of David was an early Jewish belief, doesn't matter. Because it shows proof of concept that this is the lengths that they're willing to go to, which means Christians would readily go to the same lengths because they're basically the same people.
Thank you again.
All right, there is a way to raise your hand. If you can't figure that out, if someone has a question, you can just unmute yourself, I think. I guess. I don't know if David has to approve that or not.
No, anyone should be able to unmute themselves on their own.
Yeah, so go right ahead and ask a
Dr.
question.
Perry,
if
I'd
anybody
ask
has
you
one.
another question if I may.
Sure, go for it.
This question comes out of a near total ignorance about how historians history, and only a little bit more knowledge about how scientists do what they do. But one of the things that strikes me about science is the importance of making meaningful predictions based on a hypothesis.
Yeah.
Is that something historians care about? Should they care about it?
Yes, historians do it a lot. So to give a better parallel, like there are historical sciences, right? Geology, cosmology, paleontology, like these are historical sciences that are doing the same thing, where you're making predictions about what kind of there's two ways you do it. One, you make a prediction about what kind of evidence should still be around today. So you think plate tectonic theory entails predictions about what kind of evidence should still be around, and you can confirm the theory that way. The limitation of history is that most of the evidence is destroyed and almost all the evidence is compromised by human doctoring. So, which is not usually the case for the historical sciences. So it's more like the theory of biogenesis, where all the evidence regarding the first forms of life on Earth has been destroyed, so we don't have it. And so we have to come up with some other way to test our theories about which is more likely and so on. And so historians will often do that. And that gets us to the other side of things, which is counterfactual reasoning. So a lot of history, there was a big debate about 10 years ago in the field of history generally about the validity of counterfactual reasoning and its applicability. Some of the writers on that got it and some didn't, but ultimately it is impossible to do historical reasoning without counterfactual historical reasoning. And the reason is that if you're comparing two hypotheses, you have to assume the counterfactual. So like, I have to assume that my theory is false, and therefore something else caused the evidence, in order to predict, in order to calculate how likely the evidence we have is what would result from that. So you would basically accept the theory you don't believe in, accept that it's true for a moment, and say, well, if that was true, what evidence would exist now? And then you go look for it, and presumably you don't find it, and therefore that's how you confirm that your theory is true and not that one. So you actually Bayes' theorem requires counterfactual reasoning. You have to actually assume the counter theory is true and make predictions from it as to what evidence should exist now, and then compare that with what we actually observe. And that's what people in historical sciences do as well. It's the same basic method. They just have better data, usually, less compromised and better data than we do. But we're doing the same thing, and that's actually how it works out. And I actually talk about that somewhat in the new book.
Thank you.
If anybody's got other questions, feel free to just unmute and ask.
I did have a question about earlier on in your presentation where you went through a few different examples of the mathematics of did Socrates exist and the Holocaust denial and so forth, and you probably go into this in a lot of detail in Historicity of Jesus book, but I was just curious, is it simply, I mean, especially events that happened 2,000 years ago, is there just a certain level of speculation that you need to take to be able to come up with, how likely is a religious figure to have been an historical person, for example, or of course, like you were saying with the Holocaust denial example, something that's more recent, I think that would be a lot easier to maybe reduce the margin of error, because you can look at other recent historical events as other examples. But my question was just, how do you kind of develop those ratios, I guess? Do you looking at, especially when it's, involves Jesus and events from 2,000 years ago, would an historian just look at other similar examples and try to come up with their best estimate of these different likelihoods?
Yes, and that is something I actually talk about in the book too, because I think it's important how we use benchmarking, for example. And so to give an example that's way off of what we're talking about, but and it's one I gave in Proving History, and I expand on it or make it simpler in the new book as well, which is the death of, I think it's King Henry. I might be getting which king it is backwards, but let's assume there was a death of King Henry, and maybe I've got it wrong, but this isn't my area. But there is a debate in the field over whether he was assassinated or not, whether he just died by a hunting accident or whether it was a planned killing. And so there's an argument, like the people who argue for the idea that it was a planned killing is that his successor, with unusual rapidity, seized the treasury upon immediately hearing of his death. The argument being is that that's highly improbable unless he already expected that news. In other words, he already knew he was going to be killed, which means that it was a conspiracy to kill him, that it wasn't a hunting accident. Now, you can interrogate all the assumptions here, but analyzing the logic of the argument is what they're saying is that there's this action, this event that occurred where the successor rapidly, like within minutes, seized the treasury and had everybody in place on his side doing what was necessary to take over. that is highly improbable unless there was a conspiracy to kill Henry. And that's the logic of it. Now, that's testable in a lot of different ways. You can say, like, well, out of all of the mysterious deaths, here's your prior odds. Out of all the mysterious deaths of monarchs, how many, when we get to check, actually turned out to be assassinations, right? So you can get an actual ballpark. It's not going to be 100% accurate. It has error margins and so on, but you at least have data. regarding the actual, how frequently is that the case? Is it commonly the case? Is it not commonly the case? And so on. And then you have aspects that are more abstract, such as we don't have specific examples of treasury seizing to compare, but we do have ideas like we understand the physics and the politics and the economics of doing a maneuver like that. It's like, what would have to be in place for all of that to happen? And could that have been in place by accident? And we can look at other, just sort of ballpark it, looking at benchmarks of how often those kinds of incredible moves, those rapid moves of administrative policy happen without foreplanning, and how often don't they, right? And so you can actually, there are benchmarks in the real world that you can get to. And of course, you can build out your model and explain, this is why I think it's improbable, and this is why I think it's at least this improbable. And then someone can come along and interrogate that and say, well, look, I have all of these examples that show that actually it's quite common. Therefore, your assumption that it was not common is false. But there you see the argument is now presenting evidence for the frequency, right? So we're debating the frequency of this kind of human behavior. And now that means we can actually talk about evidence for and against that frequency, whether the evidence is direct or indirect or whatever. You're at least debating the thing you're supposed to be debating, which is this improbable? And how do we know that it's improbable? And one way to avoid the ambiguities and difficulties of this is, as I was mentioning throughout the lecture, which is to err on the side of caution and come up with benchmarks that are ridiculous, but ridiculous against you. So that even if you were to correct the estimates of frequency in light of evidence of actual frequencies of comparable things, if you were to do that, the frequency would go more in your favor rather than less. So if you err hugely against yourself and still get the conclusion, the conclusion is highly probable at that point. And so that's why you don't have to defend the exact numbers you come up with. You just have to say it's got to be at least this, right? Or at most this, depending on which side of the argument you're on. And that it can always relate to actual frequencies, like empirical examples of how fast things happen or how often people do this. An example we can bring back to the question that was asked earlier about Mark, about how every chapter has unbelievable things in it. It's not just the miracles, which people often say that Mark is not that as miraculous as the other gospels, but that's not really true, because people focus on supernaturalism rather than simple improbability things. Like Jesus walks up to a couple of fishermen, speaks 2 lines to them, and then they completely abandon their families and their jobs and follow him around like a fanatic for the rest of the story. That's contrary to all human nature. Like you can look at all the examples of what it takes to convert someone like that. And does it ever happen that way? You say, no, it requires a lot more conversation, a lot more convincing, a lot more information. You can't just walk up to 2 people, speak 2 lines, and then immediately follow you. Like that is absurd. But again, the reason when we say things like that is absurd, we're saying that we don't see that in human behavior. It's the frequency of that kind of behavior is so low that we don't even have an example of it to examine. And so that's how you can get in, but yet we have many, many examples, like thousands of examples of converts joining a guru or a charismatic leader or something. So we know how it really goes, but it doesn't go like that, right? So like at least your estimates of improbability are based on something real, an actual empirical frequency. And you could say odds against that are, I'm just gonna say 100 to 1. Now, in reality, we probably have thousands of instances of conversions. 0 of them work like this. So really, we could say thousands to 1. But if we say 100 to 1, we're safe because it's definitely more than that. And so if whatever conclusion you reach with the 100 to 1, it's only going to be more certain if you were to actually adjust the frequency to some sort of more precise measure of how often people follow someone fanatically after 2 sentences being spoken to them. And so that's the kind of reasoning that we're dealing with all the time. And you just have to figure out what is the reference class, what is the frequency that I'm talking about when I say this is very improbable or I say this is absurd. I'm estimating some sort of frequency of something. And so now I have to figure out, what am I talking about? What frequency am I estimating? What evidence do I have to base that assumption on? And then you can at least, that's where you make progress. And that's why I think it's so important that historians start using this mathematical reasoning, because it forces them to bring to the foreground what assumptions they're making and on what evidence they're basing those assumptions. If you say something is improbable, like, well, you're saying a frequency. Where are you getting that frequency from? What evidence? What is your benchmark? What is your baseline? What are you using? And then they have to say, and once they say, well, now it's criticizable, right? Because they can say, well, you made a mistake, you forgot this, or that's the wrong frequency, or whatever. Like you can actually start interrogating the assumptions rather than it just being a historian's uninterrogatable opinion out of the blue. And so I think it's really important for the method to teach us how to do exactly the thing that you're asking us to do, which is to actually start talking about what are we basing these frequencies on, and how are we driving them.
Thanks. And so a quick follow-up question. I believe you touched on this in your book on the historicity of Jesus, that and you kind of mentioned you have a chapter in this new book that deals with the same topic, that critics that believe in the historicity of Jesus who have responded to your work, it's not so much that they come back with their own math. They kind of come back saying math is hard, and they don't really respond to that particular issue. They don't really address it. Is that what you've experienced in the
Yes.
past years?
I open with this problem. Yeah. No, that's why I have a quote. I open that chapter. That's why historians simply must learn math. Like, the whole first part of it is like, please, it's really not that hard, and you really need to stop saying that it's too hard. And especially for historians, it's like you master a lot of hard things. Like, you master ancient languages. You can do hard things, and yet this isn't even hard, right? Like, so that's a terrible excuse to say, like, it's too hard for me to explain why I'm right. Therefore, I'm not even going to find out why I think I'm right. We have to stop this. Like, this has to end. And there's a quote I start with by David Hackett Fisher. Wrote this fantastic book called Historians' Fallacies. I recommend everybody read it. It's a great survey of multiple historical fields and how historians screw up logic a lot, and don't know they're doing it because they don't study logic. And Fisher's point is that needs to stop. Historians need to start doing logic and understanding logic so they will not make these mistakes. But he has this quote, and there's some ellipses in here. I'm just going to read it as I've done it, but when you see in the book, you'll see where the ellipses are. But here's the quote. And this is David Hackett Fisher. If there is a field-related logic of historical thought, then working historians must help to find it. But they have contributed little of consequence in the past 40 years. And he's writing 40 years ago, so it's worse now. It's 80 years. Their articles and books on the nature of history tend to degenerate into mere exhortations or manuals on the mechanics of citation or meta-historical mumbo-jumbo. Many academic historians regard methodological and logical problems with suspicion and even hostility. Incredibly, the word logic is often a pejorative, the appropriately ugly name for this prejudice, mesology, or logic hating. Its continuing existence among academic historians explains their failure to refine a logic of historical thought. Now, that's David Hackett Fisher, who's a renowned historian in American history. So he's not just some outsider, like, he's a major historian. And so his critique of the field is quite harsh, but is accurate. It describes what you're talking about, where people come back and say it's too hard. I'm doing what I can on my end to make it easier. So that's part of what I did in this chapter is, rather than have them try to understand the long form of Bayes' theorem, which I now realize is hard. It's really not that hard, but I can make it easier is the point. So the Bayes theorem at the odds form is so easy. Like, it's literally it's like a 6th grade math problem. Like, it's easy peasy. It's as easy as calculating percentages for ad sales and things like that you're literally taught in 6th grade. So trying to find a way to make it as simple as possible without destroying the logic is this thing that I'm working on. But I think historians do need to meet me halfway and try to understand this and why their thinking is already defined by this logical formula, and how knowing that can actually improve their ability to explain why their conclusions follow from their premises, and then better critique each other's work, better actually argue for things, and better argue against things. It would improve history in every possible way. So I do think it's important that it be done.
Thanks.
Okay, do we have anyone else? Well, I think David has the room until 4, but I can sign off anytime. So if we don't have anything, I have a question in chat. If I run out of questions, could I take a tour of my bookcase? I don't really have I don't have a portable camera, so could I do it? It would be hard to set myself up to do it, to just walk around it. My bookcase has been culled. I have 4 four bookcases now, and they are packed to the point that I'm stacking books on top of books on shelves now. It's gotten bad. Four bookcases. I used to have 8. I actually culled half my books when I moved last. So I've really pared it down to the bare minimum. And it is a wild diversity of books. It would take an hour to go through. But behind me, I don't know if people could see behind me. Can I see behind me? That's a good question. Without turning around, I guess I just have to turn around. So behind me, I don't know. I can't see what's in frame. Let's see. How do I see myself? I know there's a way to do it. Let's see. Maybe they took away the do it. Maybe that's not a thing anymore in Zoom. Oh, here we go.
The entire width of your bookcase is in
Yeah.
view.
Well, that's 2 of them. So there's 2 more right over here that's way out of view that you can't see.
I mean, as far as what's
But
behind you, yeah.
but yeah, so and the bookcase keeps going. It's there are still books up there. So you see the red and green books that occupy 2 whole shelves. Those are my copies of the Loeb classics, which are ancient texts that have the ancient language, Latin in red and Greek in green. The ancient language on one side and the English translation on the other. So that's an essential resource for historians who are in my field. The complete collection would fill both of those bookcases, but those are the ones that I own are sitting there. You really can't see the titles, unfortunately, because it's shiny because of the reflection of the light. But I have a lot of mixed stuff back there. Like including the myth of the afterlife, Keith Augustine's book, which is, if you're ever frustrated by near-death experience arguments and people making arguments about how those prove the soul and stuff like that, this massive volume by Keith Augustine, The Myth of the Afterlife, is the ultimate source book for this, debunking that stuff. But also I have up top, let's see, if you go above the skull, there's complete works of Jane Austen. And then if you go all the way to the other side of that shelf, somewhere around there is the Lun Heng. There's a story behind that. When I went to UC Berkeley for my undergraduate, and I actually studied ancient Chinese history. I actually took 2 courses in that and studied under David Keatley, who at the time was the leading expert in ancient China, like ancient China. And he was my mentor and advisor for a lot of things there. But I asked him, like, were there any atheists in ancient China? And he says, oh yes, Wang Cheng, you've got to read Wang Cheng. And I'm like, Wang Cheng? Never heard of this. And Wang Cheng wrote as a Confucian from the Han Dynasty, who wrote a massive volume of essays from an atheist naturalist perspective. Like, he's actually an anti-supernaturalist Confucian. And so I was like, well, that's fascinating. Where do I find this? It's like, well, it's really hard to find. It's not in print anymore. And so I went and hunting through all the used bookstores around Berkeley until I found a complete set, like published, literally printed in the 1950s, 2-volume set of the Lun Heng translated into English. And so that's up there. That's one of my prize finds as a book, is up there. So you can see that the books diverge hugely in subject. And I shelve them by size, not by subject or author. So I actually have a library catalog. I have a digital library catalog that tells me where my books are when I want to find them. So that's why all the books have the same size per shelf. That's how I decide. So that's why there's a huge range of things. On one shelf, there'll be a book by Hitler on one moment, because I actually did Hitler studies for a bit too. And then right next to that will be a book about polyamory or something, right? So there's a lot of stuff back there. Like I said, it would take hours to go through it. Couple shelves of fiction, but I don't have a lot of fiction. Most of it's nonfiction. I don't know. That's the best I can do.
I think I'll just ask every other question, if that's all right with you, Dr. Carrier.
Sure.
So at some point in your presentation earlier, I noticed that you mentioned that you thought it was, I don't know what, I can't remember what probability you kind of implied with it, but you suggested that Josephus could be based on Luke, was it Luke? Okay.
Yeah.
I had recall hearing what to me seemed like a pretty compelling argument that Acts, some of the stuff in Acts was based on Josephus.
Right.
It really have to be either or, but do you give credence to that theory? Does it go both ways?
Yes. No, I think in fact, so yeah, obviously Christian apologists don't want that to be true. So Goldberg doesn't like that idea that Acts was using the antiquities. And that would prove, of course, if Acts used antiquities, that would prove the testimonium cannot have been written by Josephus, because it had to have been written by someone after Josephus published, which means it has to be a Christian interpolation. But yeah, there's a lot of evidence for this. Let's see, there's Mason and Feldman and various other experts on Josephus have agreed with this. The evidence is pretty conclusive. Purvo is another one. The scholars have shown that it's very clear that the Book of Acts, whoever wrote it was writing after the Gospel of Luke, first of all. And secondly, was doing it using the antiquities for color content, right? Like they wanted to add details, so they're riffing details out of there. And one of the best, I don't know if for everybody who's watching knows this already, but one of the best pieces of evidence for this, not just like all of the incidents, the coincidences and so on, but the really best one is the mistake. So this is one of the things that we can always catch forgers is by their mistakes. And this is true even like the Gospel of Jesus's wife recently was outed as a forgery because the forgers who used it foolishly used a digital copy of a text to fake their version, but the digital copy had a typo in it that wasn't in the print version of it. So they preserved a modern computer typo in their forgery. So it's the mistakes that give them away, right? And that's one of the, we love catching them making mistakes because it's really hard to not make any mistakes. There's 1,000 different ways you can make a mistake. You can't police them all. So forgers, they don't always get caught this way, but often that's the best way to catch them. And in this, the Book of Acts, the author of Acts has Gamaliel, who's a known historical figure, give a speech about all these other pretenders, these messianic pretenders before Jesus, and trying to compare Jesus to them. And so, they all failed, so this movement will fail too, yada, yada. And so he gives a sort of canned history of messianic movements in Judea, but he screws up the chronology. He has Theodos. Theodos wasn't even active until after Gamaliel. So Gamaliel is psychically talking about a guy in the future as if he was in the past. And he gives the order of them, and the order is wrong chronologically. And so the chronology is all hosed here. But what someone observed long ago, and many scholars have pointed this out as well, is that the Antiquities does have them in that order, but Josephus talks about one of them in a flashback, right? So Josephus has the chronology correct, but the physical order in the book is the order that got preserved in the Book of Acts. So whoever was writing the Book of Acts was not paying close attention to the chronology markers. They were just running through the scroll looking for messianic pretenders and just used them in the order and had invented a speech for Gamaliel, not realizing that the Theodos wasn't before Gamaliel, right? And not realizing that the order is not the order that is in the book. It's the chronological order is looped through a flashback that Josephus did. So that's an example of how there isn't any explanation for that mistake other than someone using the scroll of the Antiquities by Josephus to do it. And once you add that to all the other evidence, that the probabilities stack, and so you get a huge Bayes factor if you were to work it out. I haven't done it, but it's obvious that the Bayes factor would be hugely in favor of that being the case.
Then, thank you. The argument I heard was based on a different part of the narrative, so I wasn't aware of that.
There's many, yeah, that was just one example. There's many others. So that's my favorite one because I always love errors. The errors that give forgers away is one of my favorite things to find. Anyone else? We're at 3:20.
Yeah, if there are no other questions, we can start wrapping things up.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for your talk. I mean, it was great and very interesting. And I'm also I enjoy watching your talks on YouTube too, but I'm glad this wasn't like a Historicity 101 talk where, because I think a lot of the people here are familiar with at least the basics of
Yeah, I think no, I was actually excited to give this talk because I know it updates things that people want to hear where we are on a lot of this stuff. So yeah. And thank you for hosting this. I really appreciate it. I know you invested a lot of time and resources in it.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I'm glad there was a good online presence and yeah, and just for anyone watching, so this is being recorded. I plan to put this maybe on YouTube, but I can send Dr. Carrier a link to the video, and he could possibly put it on his blog or something for you know, worldwide audience to check out.
Yeah, righto.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, thanks everybody. You can find everything else about me at richardcarrier.info. If you want to find anything more about my work or writings or social media and whatnot.
Thanks.